Modo's action centers give us several useful ways to easily set the position and orientation of our transform tools. They let us manipulate our items in geometry in a way that is completely separate from the center or pivot of the item that we're manipulating. This makes positioning and orienting items in relation to other items really easy. I've added some items from the mesh presets that come with Modo. These are from the spacecraft category if you're looking for them. Okay, let's click on our Action Center drop-down. And the first thing you need to know is that these top section Action Center presets are just built out of combinations of these center positions and these axis orientations. And while we're here at the axis orientations, I'm going to take a second to just note that this auto axis could also be called world, because it's really just the world axis, the straight up Y world axis. Right now we can see that we don't have a specific action center selected. And if I activate a tool, like the rotate tool, the gizmo for that tool always shows up at the center of our object. And if we had a pivot defined, it would show up at the pivot as we saw in the last video. And if I click around, nothing happens. My gizmo stays in exactly the same place. I'll go up to the action centers and select automatic. A quick way to tell which action center you have selected is to just look down here in the lower left. Right now it says Action Center Auto and Action Axis Auto. To see how this automatic action center changes the behavior of our tools, I'll first just go around and select my different mesh items. As before, my rotate gizmo shows up at my mesh item center, but now with the automatic action center active, if I click in the viewport, the position of my rotate gizmo will move to where my click intersects with the work plane. And if I rotate, my item will rotate around that position. And keep in mind that setting this position has nothing to do with where my mesh item center is, and I didn't need to set a new pivot anywhere. Also notice that when I'm in this state where I've already changed my action center, if I hover my pointer over my item, it looks like I can click on it because it's highlighting, but if I click, my automatic action center ignores my item and has still positioned itself where it intersects the work plane. If I drop the rotate tool and then reactivate it, the gizmo defaults back to the center of my mesh item until I click away from it again. All of this can be done from the orthographic views too. With this turret item selected, I'll switch to a top view by hitting 1 on the numeric keypad. And with my rotate tool still active, I can place it wherever I want. And rotate it. And of course the automatic action center works when you're in component mode too. But let me show you an issue you might encounter and a way to avoid it when you're in component mode. I'll select our little spaceship hatch down here, and then I'll go into polygons mode. If I double click these polygons to select them, and then activate my move tool, my tool snaps to the center of the selection as we saw before. And if I click with my left mouse button anywhere else, my tool snaps to where it intersects the work plane. But notice that when I click with my left mouse button, if I hold down my mouse button and drag, I can immediately start moving my selected polygons. Sometimes this is useful. Other times when you click, you might accidentally move your selected components slightly, and that's not good. So to avoid that happening, you can use your right mouse button to position your automatic action center. And it will place the tool, but it won't activate it. So your selection won't accidentally move or rotate. But this right mouse button click only works when you're in component mode, not items mode. Now let's look at the next action center, which is the selection action center. I've got my spaceship engine item selected, and I'm in polygons mode. I don't have any polygons selected, so that means that all of my polygons are selected. And now I'll go up and activate the selection action center, and then activate my rotate tool. And my tool by default snaps to the center of my current selection, and sets its center based on the average vertex position of my selection. But I can also change where my center is based on the bounding box of my selection. by going over here to the center mode and changing it to one of the other modes. I'll drop the rotate tool and just select a few polygons from our engine, and then bring up the rotate tool. And you can see how it's aligned based on the polygons I have selected. And I can still change my center mode. I'll just undo that. I'll drop my rotate tool, and I'm going to select all the polygons in this ring right here just by hitting the L key. And with the Selection Action Center still active, I'll bring up the Scale tool. And I can scale all of these polygons and change the look of my engine just a little bit. Now I'm going to select the entire top half of this engine. I'll just double click the polygons. And now I want to rotate this top part. I'll bring up the rotate tool, change back to center mode. And I can already see that my axis is skewed a little bit here. I want my axis to be straight up and down, because if I try to rotate the way it is now, my rotation is not going to work correctly. And if I bring up the Move tool, you can see that it's not pointing straight up either. So what's going on here? Well, I'm going to move this up, and right now I can tell that part of the top of the spaceship did not get selected. So I'm left with this unbalanced, unsymmetrical part. And since my axis is based on selection, it's giving me a skewed orientation. I'll undo the move, drop the Move tool, and then I'll go and select the parts that I missed when I selected all the parts originally. Okay, I think I got them all now. Now if I activate the rotate, I can see that the axis is better, but it's still not quite straight up and down. And if I rotate, my rotation is still off a little bit. I'll undo that. So how can I fix this axis? Well, there are two ways. I can go up to the Action Center drop-down and go down to where it says Axis and select Auto. And this will override my current Selection Action Center axis. And now down here you see that it says Action Center Selection, which means the center of my Action Center is based on what I have selected, and my action axis is set to Auto, which means that it's actually using the world axis. Let me switch to the Move tool so you can see that. You can see that my axis is straight up and down because it's the world axis. And now I can rotate correctly. And this combination that I have now, this Action Center Selection and Action Axis Auto, is exactly the same as if I had selected Selection Center Auto Axis. You see that nothing changes when I select that. With this combination, you get your position based on your selection and a straight up world axis alignment. Now let's look at the Selection Border Action Center. Here I have a capsule primitive, and I'm using the Selection Action Center. I'm going to select half of these polygons using my middle mouse button, and then if I bring up the Scale tool, my gizmo pops to right into the middle of my selection, and I can scale up my selected polygons. I'll undo that. But what if I want to scale up right from the edge here, right from the end of my selection? Well, watch what happens if I change to Selection Border. My gizmo jumps to the center of the open end or border of my selection, and I can scale and rotate from there if I want to. Let's undo that. But you might wonder why we don't just use the plain Selection Action Center and then change the center mode. If we change it to back, that actually works pretty well in this case. But what if our geometry is rotated a bit? I'll drop the tool, deselect my polygons, and then I'll rotate our capsule a little bit. drop the tool, and now select my polygons again. If we hit the scale tool, you can see that because the orientation of all of the vertices is angled now, our position isn't correct. And if we try to scale from there, we get a very different effect. If we change our center mode back to center, that works okay because it's still in the center of our selection, but now we're resizing from a different place. So if we go back to use selection border, our gizmo still goes to the right place, and we can scale just like we did before. And that's because the center of this action center is the border or edge of our selection. Now let's see how the element action center works. The element action center lets us align our transform tools to any element, such as a polygon, vertex, or edge. Here I have my little space arm object, and this is all one mesh. The arms aren't separated, and it's been modeled already at an angle. So let's say we want to rotate this top arm section, but we want to make sure that we do it based on the center of this middle joint. I can do that really easily by using the element action center. So I'll switch to the element action center, and then I'll select all of the parts of my upper arm here. And then I'll select the rotate tool. With the element action center selected, you can see that as I move my pointer over different parts of the object that they highlight. If I want to make sure that my rotation is based on the center of this joint, all I have to do is hover over this center polygon and click. Now I can rotate my arm based on that polygon's orientation. And let's say we want to move the arm and this joint up and down this angled mount right here. I'll drop the tool, double click on this center joint, and then I'll bring up my move tool, and then I'm going to use one of the edges of this center mount here as my orientation. And now I can move up and down perfectly at the angle of that mount. I can even select other mesh items in my item list and use elements from them. Let's just select all of our polygons here. And now you can see that as I move around, let's say I put my rotate tool on, as I move around that I'm highlighting on other mesh items as well. Like so. Also be aware of this section down here in the drop-down called Element Mode. In here we can modify the behavior of our element selection while using the Element Action Center. For example, by default it's set to Auto Center. And if I go to an edge and click, I'll switch to the Move tool. My tool gets put in the center of whatever edge I click on. But if I go up to the Element Mode panel and change it to just plain edge, then wherever I click is where my tool will get put. I consider the Element Action Center to be one of the most useful, and I use it a lot. Moving on, we have the Screen Action Center. And this Action Center simply aligns our Transform tool to the plane of our screen. So if I select my Rotate tool, you can see that as I move my view around here, my tool gets aligned to it. And switching to the Origin Action Center, you can see that it simply puts the gizmo at the origin of the world coordinates. Really more useful for rotation and scaling than moving. I'm going to skip the Parent Action Center for now, and let's take a look at the Local Action Center. The Local Action Center lets you select separate elements or groups of elements and manipulate them on a localized basis. I'm just going to go in and select all of these little cylinders under this ring here. And with the local action center selected, I can manipulate all of them using each group or cluster of polygons as its own individual item. So when I activate the scale tool, you can see that it gets placed in the center of just one of the clusters. But whatever I do to that cluster gets done to whatever other clusters of polygons I have selected. Let's look at another example. Let's say we want to flare out these back parts on this turret here. With the local action center still active, I'll double click on each one of them to select them. And if I activate the scale tool and add a linear fall off, I can flare out one part and affect all the others in the same way. But notice what happens if I try to scale up just one axis. As you can see, we get a somewhat different behavior in each cluster, and this can happen from time to time as Modo does its best to guess the orientation of each cluster. I'll undo that. In this case, I can fix this by simply going up to the Action Center dropdown, going down to the axis, and overriding the current local axis with an auto axis. Now if I change my fall off axis, when I scale in one axis, all of my parts act the same. There's one more trick you can do with the local action center that's very useful, and that's to use it to straighten and flatten geometry. Let's say we want to modify this sort of barrel-shaped object here into a cylinder. We can use the local action center to quickly do this. I'll select one of the edge strips by double-clicking on it, and then I'll hit Alt-L for the ring select tool. And with the local action center selected, I'll activate the scale tool. And you can see that when I scale on one of the axes, the barrel shape bows in and out. But we want these edges perfectly straight all around. Well, what we need to do is restrict the scaling so it can't go into negative territory. So I'll just deselect negative scale over here. And now when I scale, when my scaling hits 0, I can't scale anymore, and my edges are straight. But this sort of cup shape isn't really what I'm going for. I don't want my edges angled, I want them straight top to bottom. I'll undo my last scale operation, and all I have to do to get the result I want is to go up and change the axis from local to auto. Now I can scale on this axis, and scale on this axis, and I have my cylinder. And my edges are perfectly straight top to bottom. Another example is this shape over here. Let's look at it from a top view. Now I know we haven't covered Modo's UV tools yet, but you can imagine this being the kind of shape you might see in a UV map. Let's say we want to straighten this edge to properly UV this shape. I'll make sure we're using the local action center, and I'll select all the verts on this edge. And then I'll activate the scale tool. And it might be a little hard to see, but my scale axis is actually off a little bit. And if I scale, this edge is not perfectly parallel to the one over here. Again, to fix this, I can just go up and override my axis and make it the auto axis. And now after my scale, this edge is perfectly parallel to this one over here. Using the local action center in this way is very handy, and it's another action center technique I use all the time. Now let's take a look at the rest of the action centers. The final 3 action center presets all make use of item pivots in some way, and they're really most useful when working in component mode rather than item mode. First, let's look at the pivot action center. Right now I have 2 mesh items, a cube and a modified cylinder. I currently don't have any action center selected, and notice that I'm in items mode. If I select the cylinder and activate the rotate tool, The rotate gizmo goes to the center of our item as we expect. Now let's modify the pivot of our cylinder. First, let's turn on pivot visibility by pressing the O key, going to the Visibility tab, and changing Show Pivots from None to All. Now we can see the pivot for our cube and for our cylinder. With the cylinder selected, I can either go into the pivot mode by selecting it up here, as we did before, or I can save a step and just activate my Move tool, and over here in the Tool Properties, I can select Pivot. Now when I move, I'm just moving the pivot, not the mesh item. This option is only available when you're in Items mode. Now with my pivot in this new position, I'll go back into Polygons mode. If I activate the Rotate tool, you can see that because we're in Component mode, our tool still goes to the center of our polygons. Well, what if we want to use our Item Pivot as our Action Center instead? Well, that's where the Pivot Action Center comes into play. I'll turn on the Pivot Action Center, and right away you can see the gizmo jump to our pivot that we repositioned earlier, and I can rotate around that point. And if I turn off the Pivot Action Center, I'm back to using the center of my current selection of polygons, which in this case is all the polygons. The Pivot Action Center lets us have two different transform points to quickly switch between when modeling. Now let's look at the Parent Action Center. First, I'm going to parent my cylinder to my cube. To do that, I'll go over to the Items list and drag my cylinder mesh on top of my cube mesh. And you can see that we now have a representation of our hierarchy in our items list. I'll make sure that I'm in items mode, and if I rotate our cube, the cylinder goes along for the ride. Now I'm going to modify the pivot of my cube. I'll activate the Move tool and make sure Pivot is selected. Then I'll just move the pivot of my cube over a little bit. Now let's go back to our cylinder and go back into Polygons mode. And we now have three different transform points we can work with. With no Action Center, I can rotate in the center of my selection. With the Pivot Action Center selected, I can rotate around the pivot point of my item. And with the Parent Action Center selected, I can rotate around the pivot of my parent item. The last Action Center to go over is the Pivot Center Parent Axis Action Center. This Action Center will use the pivot center of my selection and the axis orientation of whatever item my mesh is parented to. I'll switch into Items mode and select my cube and just rotate it a little bit. I'll use the Automatic Action Center to do this. And when I rotate, of course, my cylinder goes along for the ride because it's parented to the cube. Then I'll select my cylinder mesh, and I'll select my pivot, and I'm going to rotate the pivot 45 degrees just to make it different from the cube. Now I'll make sure that I'm in Polygons mode, and if I select the Pivot Action Center and rotate, my cylinder rotates around the pivot, as it did before. But now watch what happens when I switch to our Pivot Center Parent Axis Action Center. Our axis aligns to that of whatever mesh we're parented to, and we can rotate around that axis. Now we can switch between the axis of our pivot and the axis of our parent. And that wraps up this video on Modo's Action Centers. Coming from Max or another package, these tools may seem a bit foreign at first, but it's well worth your time to play with them and get a good handle on how they work. They really do speed up your workflow in a significant way. Next, we take a look at Modo's snapping tools.